Welcome to the coral reef ecology video on morphology of the coral reefs. Uh, you can see a little bit of the forereef here where the waves tend to pile up from deep water to shallow water. And we're going to be talking about some of the structures and the processes which form those structures based on the environment, the abiotic environment like wind and waves in this video. So we're going to start today's lecture with this beautiful YouTube video. And you can see the link here. In class we'll play it, but I've also included it on Moodle. It's called Dave's Lecture Opening YouTube Video. Play this one with slide 2 on the lecture video. That's in topic 1. And it's after you've done that, or while you're watching that video, just notice how different the habitat is to the New Zealand diving that you're used to. I'm not sure how many of you dived in or snorkeled up in the tropics, but write down a couple of things you notice about the fish that are different in New Zealand and a couple of things about the habitat. And then do the coral quiz in topic 1 section on Moodle, which is essentially a Word document, but it's interactive. And it's really just to get you to see how much you remember and give you a little refresher of memory. So you learned a bit about coral reefs in ecology last year, and today we're going to be recapping and extending that knowledge about coral reefs and the morphology, how they develop, why they develop, and really they're incredibly important. You can see this slide with people who live on boats, and they even build fires on the boats and everything. You can see there's a little fire on this cooking pot where they're cooking these fish, and they live on the coral reefs, and they glean all their protein and all out of these coral reefs, and this is the way a lot of people live. And without coral reefs, then these people have got to find some other way to live. And that's just one aspect of how important these coral reefs are. So Dan outlined the whole course for you on the first day. And have a look at this picture of Keith Gregor, one of our former tutors, took this on Easter Island. Very similar to Niue. It's a little bit colder water there than like Coral Triangle, like PNG or Hawaii and places like that, where this is a little bit cooler, and the corals are kind of like little lumps and things like that there. So you might go to Niue and find the same thing. But it's really good to sort of get around, and hopefully you'll get a chance to travel and see some of these differences in environments. So again, we're going to be talking about how these coral reefs respond in this lecture to a lot of abiotic factors, and then we're also going to be talking about the function and the importance of these reefs and how they generate a lot of oxygen and primary productivity. And then Romany will outline things like threats to the management of reef systems, threats to and management of the reef systems, things that you'll need to know if you start working with these environments, and you'll need to be able to outline what the dangers and what the destructive things are that are going on in the world to these habitats, these fragile habitats. And you'll hopefully be able to apply all this knowledge when you start doing your surveys and your report. It just occurred to me that I should probably define morphology. I sort of assumed that you would know what morphology meant, but in case you don't, morph means shape. So anytime you see the root morph, you're talking about the shape of something. And when we're talking about morphology, or the study of the shape, the morphology of coral reefs, we're talking about the particular types of corals, how branched they are, how big they are, and what kind of reef slope you're going to get, and all of that. And that is often determined, or pretty much always determined, by the abiotic factors and a few biotic factors. And so you'll see typical structures in one part of the reef and different structures in others. A little bit of review, making sure that you're right up there. All right, so for the next 2 lectures, here's how the structure is going to go. Generally, we're doing a general review of coral reefs, and we're going to talk a little bit about how important they are locally and globally in terms of food for humans, as well as production, primary production, and overall biomass production that feeds the local inhabitants, the flora and fauna, and globally as well too, because these things are widespread throughout the tropics and contribute massively to the primary production of the whole marine ecosystem. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of coral reefs, how they form in the first place, and the structure of the coral reefs. And when I say structure, it's about atolls versus fringing reefs versus barrier reefs. And then we're going to talk a bit about the habitat variety, like we were saying, within those reefs. What types of habitats are typically found in different types of coral reefs. We're going to do a little bit of the ecology of our field location, which is yet to be specified and may be changing year to year. And then Romany will be taking you through threats to coral reefs, management strategies to deal with those threats, and that's a very extensive topic. And we're going to look at some case studies of good and bad. All right, let's get stuck in. So we're talking about coral reefs, and they're generally made up of corals. There's a huge amount of other types of organisms, and they're pretty amazing places, really. It's nice that they're warm and clear water. They're really nice for us as well. But you really don't have to spend too long to realize how amazing they are. If you sit and watch just what's going on in a quadrat, in a meter quadrat, or sit on the sand at the edge of a reef and just sit quietly and watch what's happening. There is so much going on with so many different organisms, so much activity, things coming in and out, things showing themselves out of the coral, an incredible diversity, really very much like a rainforest. These ultra stable environments lead to a lot of niche specialization and a lot of diversity. So you get places like rainforests where the temperature doesn't change that much and rainfall is consistent, or at least enough so that there's moisture all year round. And same with these coral reefs where the light levels don't change drastically from one part of the season to the one part of the year to the next, and the temperature doesn't change as much as a temperate area. It's really quite amazing what you'll see. So let's go have a quick flick through of a lot of the different types of organisms that do live on a coral reef. So one type is the soft corals, we're called gorgonians, and they used to be their own, class? I think class, and now, or it might have been a subclass, but now they're grouped in with Alcyoniacea. It was Gorgosea, or Gorgonacea. Anyway, the sea fans and whips, you'll see lots of this kind of thing. These fans here on the left, that stick up into the current. These things are very often in high current areas, or areas with not too much wave action, because they're soft, but they do like areas with a lot of current, and they tend to feed during the day. And of course, Paul's going to be going over all of this with you, and in more detail, the types of corals. Let's see if this link works. Oh, for some reason. The link is blank, but if you open up the PowerPoint, you'll find this link, which is a nice flyover, and it is shows you all of these beautiful soft corals here, and you can see that it looks kind of like a coral reef. It is. It's a soft coral reef, and they're very flexible. It's not the hard structure. That's a very healthy looking soft coral reef. We have the millipora, the fire corals. So they'll have different morphs, like these little fingers that pop out, and other ones like so. Kind of fingers off of a plate on the one on the left, and then the big fingers like Alcyonium here, and then some of these other sort of I don't know what you'd call them, like shoehorn type corals. And if you look closely at these, you'll see lots of polyps, and they're not hard structures. So when these die away, some of them are, oh, they are hard structures, sorry. When these die away, the bodies that where they've made calcium carbonate become part of the reef structure. And then we have things like mollusks, like this giant clam, and these things can get, you know, near the good portion of a meter wide. And so if you think about that kind of organism producing structures that pile up on the reef, then that's adding to the reef structure. Things like the cuttle bones of cuttlefish and lots of gastropods. Some of which don't have shells, but I thought I'd put them in there anyway. The lots of beautiful nudibranchs. Anyway, all of the parts with hard shell, all the mollusks with hard parts, those pile up and become part of the reef as well. And then you have things like the echinoderms, where if you've broken a kinetest open, you'll know they've got all the little ossicles. All of the different echinoderms have ossicles, and when these things break up, then that's more biogenic material, calcium carbonate as well. All of it's calcium carbonate, really, that is added to the reef. And even the crustacean bodies, things like this. This guy, he's rust spotted. What the heck is his name? Rust spotted something crab. Guard crab, a rust-spotted guard crab. But it's amazing. You can see them inside, or hanging around in this little coral polyp inside a fire coral, in the crevices of a fire coral. And when you sit and look at a reef, you'll just be astounded at the diversity. Like there are lobsters and mantis shrimp and things like that, but also urchin shrimp, and it's just amazing how many different types of animals there are on the coral reef. Then we get things like polychaete worms, like the Christmas tree worms, and these bobbit worms, and they all have hard calcium carbonate parts that are part of the what piles up on a reef. Sponges, so here where we get siliceous stuff, not just calcium carbonate, but silica that piles up all the spicules in these big things. And we've got fish that you're going to be, when you go to the tropics, you're actually going to see this. This is very, very common, that you're going to have parrotfish pooing out clouds of sand, and that is from the eating the coral. And Dean will go very more thoroughly through with the fish with you. And then not to be underestimated are things like these green calcareous algae. And you can see the aragonite crystals actually on the surface of these things, which makes them much harder to be predated or grazed on. But when those break up, the particles will be of the size that can contribute to either mud or sand, depending on how big they are. But all of that calcium carbonate, which aragonite is one type of calcium carbonate. It's the less soluble type, but that will add up and pile up and contribute to the reef structure as well. And then very importantly, you have all of this coralline algae. So we have coralline algae here, as very much like that as this. There's crustose forms like this. There's the uh, more structured forms that grow up as well. But this coralline algae, it acts like the cement that glues all these little pieces together and really creates a lot more um, resiliency to wave action and other things with the because of um, this coralline algae cementing everything together. It's really probably not thought about as much as the corals, but it's quite a big list of things that are all contributing to the growth. It's all biogenic. It's all due to photosynthesis and then things being grazed and producing structures that help these animals live. And as long as these things are healthy, they're going to keep adding more and more calcium carbonate that can help the reef build up. And then also bacteria are not to be underestimated. But we'll talk a little bit more about those. Look at this. Isn't it beautiful? When I look at this, all I can see is potential for spending endless time diving around the island and or snorkeling around it and just slowing down and around every corner, every one of these little bommies. There'd be something new to look at. Lots and lots of fish. Anyway, what hopefully you'll get out of this course is also by having these lectures, having this theory, and also by getting the chance to go and spend a time on an island like this, which is what we're going to be doing. You're going to be able to understand a little bit about why the corals take a branched form here that's not the same as up in here. And hopefully you're going to understand why there's a steeper slope here than here where it's more shallower slope, and why this beach forms, and how this whole thing responds to waves or desiccation. And as you go across the reef, what suite of organisms you might find with this type of coral that's here. What suite of animals that will be associated. And by doing that, by being able to take the time and not just have a glance, by when we go for a long time and you do repetitive dives, you can start to get to understand the character of the reef a little bit. And hopefully you'll be able to make some assessments about whether a reef is healthy or not. And after hearing some of the theory in this course and reading outside and listening and just paying attention and being a generally curious person, you'll maybe be able to understand and actually advise and put some implementation of remediation programs if there is some problem that can be identified. That would be fantastic if you could get that outcome out of this course. So coral reefs, they're massive structures. They make up something like 600,000 square kilometers of the planet's surface, and we've seen all of these things that are being produced by biological activity. So they're called biogenic structures, or built by organisms. And like we said, they're very three-dimensional, very diverse in terms of their habitat as well as the organisms that are there. And all that structural complexity means that there's a lot of different niches for amazing amounts of life. But all that life that we're talking about, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years, these coral reefs. And so what does that mean for the global carbon budget is that all of that calcium carbonate that's been locked up, it comes out of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which means that these things are incredibly important in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere when it dissolves into the water that can be uptaked and turned into calcium carbonate by this biological activity. So there's endless amounts of work to be done on
coral reefs within coral reefs. And if you come to the classroom lecture, then I'll go through a conference proceeding that we have that just gives you a little bit of the uh, some understanding of how wide-ranging and how many people are involved with doing research around coral reefs. Because they're not just removing carbon dioxide, but they're, as we've said before, producing medicines, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of fantastic benefits that we get as human beings, and that the overall ecology derives from coral reefs. Okay, I know some of these are quite wordy PowerPoint slides, but we'll just touch on these and you'll get a lot more deeply into it. But I'll give you a couple of interesting facts about how important these coral reefs are, why we need to take care of them and look after them and study them and understand them. So worldwide, these are pre-COVID facts as well too, so that some of the tourist stuff might be a bit out of date, but it'll probably be back to that at some point. So around 850 million people live within 100 kilometers of reefs, and about 275 million people reside are within 30 kilometers of reefs. And in a good portion of the places like the Coral Triangle and some of these very populated places like Indonesia, a lot of livelihoods are likely to depend on reefs and their resources and food. So that includes 94 countries and territories that have tourism and these benefits. Some of them, and so in 23 of those countries and territories, more than 15% of all their gross domestic product. So how that's like 15% of their whole budget is because people are coming to look at uh, the the corals through tourism. So, and that's not including all tourism. That's just tourism that is can be linked to the reefs. So about 15,000 kilometers of shoreline in 100 countries will receive some protection from coral reefs. So that means that wave energy is dissipated, erosion, storm damage, all of that kind of thing. These things can shelter them from the big ocean, open ocean seas and um, giant waves of tsunamis and things like cyclones. And we've talked about the calcium that's taken up and bound into coral reefs within global cal um, the global carbon budget each year. Okay, and the interesting thing about these things is that although they're a couple hundred million years old, and they are really resilient to things like waves and some quite drastic effects. They're actually quite susceptible to human effects like touch and things like sedimentation and other disturbances that humans put on them. So we're putting the coral reefs under a lot of pressure. So where do we find coral reefs? Well, they follow pretty much this 20-degree isotherm pretty closely. If you see the this dotted line here, might make it let's go, blue or white. So this dotted line here it tells you where there is 20 degrees Celsius waters on average. So you have upwelling areas here where you can't just necessarily say within the tropic lines because some areas are colder. There's upwelling in a couple of places that push the boundary of the corals north, and then say down here along the coast of South America, then the currents actually extend the latitudinal um, uh, distribution of coral reefs. But anyway, they tend to be in places where the average water temperature is greater than 20 degrees Celsius. So we find that the coral reef distribution follows this sort of 20-degree isotherm, right? And where the water's average is 20 degrees, because there is some temperature dependency on for these organisms. And we also split them up into two main groups, which are the Indo-Pacific corals, and they're the older ones. The American corals, they branched off of the Indo-Pacific corals quite a long time ago. Uh, but the Indo-Pacific corals are much higher in diversity. So, for example, there's Acropora or Acropora, depending on how you want to hear it pronounced. So in the Indo-Pacific area, that there are something like closing in on 200 species, I'm pretty sure. And in the Pacific, or in the in the American fauna, there are only 3. Okay, there are more mollusks, more fish diversity, especially the hot spot of diversity in this coral triangle right here. They like something like this, a triangle. The coral triangle actually comes down into the top of Australia. So that's called the coral triangle, and that has by far the greatest diversity per square meter of any corals on the planet. And for example, you have no anemone fish, no clownfish in the American uh, uh, grouping of coral reefs, but lots and lots, 40 or 50 different species of anemone fish in the Pacific. Um, let's see, more soft coral diversity in the Pacific. Um, we get some interesting differences like over here, the primary method of recruitment is fragmentation, where things break off and are distributed that way. There are also spawning events here, but mostly spawning events here. And so you got more, since you have more diversity, you have more intense herbivory and predation in the Indo-Pacific coral grouping. And so these are the main things that separate the two types of corals. We do see coral fringing reefs and structure very similar in you know, we've got fringing reefs and atolls and all sorts in both of the groupings. And a lot of the reason why these things don't mix and there's not diversity, although that is keeps changing, like lionfish with being transported by aquarium trade, or if you have things transported by ballast water. But this is such a large area, and for larval transport, it's very difficult for larvae to be transported from one part of the Pacific, from the western side to the eastern side. Yeah, following on from that, there are not just larval distribution, but there are other aspects that affect the uh, distribution of corals globally, and one of them is the circulation patterns. So these ocean circulation patterns, like you can see these patterns here, and where the trade winds drive these global circulation patterns, that means that the larval distribution stage of all of these corals and a lot of the associated species, like the little polychaetes and all that broadcast spawn, those larvae are not going to be able to swim against those currents to go back towards the to cross the ocean from the Indo-Pacific into the American grouping. So that effectively isolates those two. And then it's interesting to think about plate tectonics, and should enough time pass, that distribution or circulation patterns change, there could be a coming together of a lot of different types of these two different groupings, and then there'd be massive competition and changes to diversity, changes, some winners and some losers. So temperature is another one, and you can see that also these distribution or these circulation patterns right here, as we've mentioned before, create the same influences in temperature of the water, where you get upwelling here and here. Really rich areas for fisheries, and you get penguins coming up quite far north and things like that. Lots of cold water species that come quite a way up. But because those corals like to live in that 20 to 30 degree temperature range, then you can see that the distribution of corals is affected by temperature here, as we said before. And it's interesting, like sometimes you're in Papua New Guinea here, and it's really, really pleasant. But some people would even say it's too warm occasionally, where you wind up looking at your computer and you might find that you get 32, 33 degrees, which is sort of getting up into the overly warm for a lot of corals temperature, but very nice to spend a day in. And then another factor is bathymetry. So corals need they kind of need shallow stepping stones for the larva to settle. And if they have those shallow stepping stones, then that means that they can settle. The corals can take advantage of sunlight, and then they will be able to spawn, and then the larva will be able to move far enough, sort of a distance that is not too far that they die before they can find a place to settle and live again. So I'm going to stop the video here right now, and then I will do because we're already at 30 minutes. So we are going to do part 2 of this lecture in a second video. All right, we'll see you in morphology 2.